Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second Water Talk of this winter term, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Oliver Brandes from the Faculty of Law from the University of Victoria to you, who's going to give this Water Talk. You see the presentation here next to me. So I'm very happy to announce him and to give you a brief background overview of where he comes from. So he's a very interesting character because he has a degree both in law and in economics, which is very rare. I can tell you from experience. He's the Associate Director of Strategic Partnerships and Public Policies of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. And he also serves as the co-director of the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance, again based at the University of Victoria. He's an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Law, as I mentioned, and the School of Public Administration. And his work focuses on water sustainability, sound resource management, public policy development, and ecologically based legal and institutional reform. In 2012, he developed BC's first water law course at the University of Victoria's Faculty of Law, and he's furthermore the founding member of the National Forum for Leadership on Water, abbreviated in FLOW, together with Tony Maas, who used to be the chair of the Water Institute's advisory board. He's an advisor, furthermore, on numerous national, provincial, local water organizations and governments, non-governmental organizations, including the BC Ministry of Environment, where he is supporting the ongoing development of the Provincial Water Sustainability Act. And today's talk, The Future of Water Law and Governance, Stories from the West, will explore the elements and attributes of watershed governance as they are emerging in BC. Please join me in welcoming Oliver to the floor.
Thank you, very nice. Always makes me a bit nervous when I get an introduction like that, because I think, oh, who's that? He sounds important. Not nearly important. I feel like we've already achieved the first hurdle. My big fear, of course, is you come to these talks, you don't know, will 1 people, 2 people, 3 people show up? So we got a reasonably full room. I stacked the crowd a bit with some relatives and some paid actors, so that helps. Before I start, though, it is a tradition in British Columbia and indeed the West, and becoming increasingly common everywhere, which is you acknowledge whose land you're on, and especially when we're talking about water, which is so fundamental to life and prosperity. I feel that this is an important tradition that I'm going to bring forward. So I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Haudenosaunee, the Neutral, the Anishinaabe people on whose lands and territories we are currently visiting, I'm visiting, and thank them for their hospitality. So with that, I'd like us to jump in here. One of my other curses or challenges that I face is I have a lot to say. Lawyers sometimes have a lot of words. So what I've done is I've built you a bit of a story. I'm going to bring you on a bit of a journey. Maybe different than how a scientist might look at the water journey, but I think it's informed by that. But I'm going to tell you a bit about how the law is, how we make decisions about water, and how it's changing. And I think if I've done my job well, I'm going to give you a sense, not just in a good Canadian metaphor, not just where the puck is, but where will the puck be. And so you can tell me at the end if I achieve this or not. So I'm going to start by giving you the 3 key messages. So this is the part where if you pay attention now, you can take a nap and wake up at the end, and then we will have achieved my mission. But I think the 3 key messages are getting water right is critical. To what? To everything. You cannot think of anything to which water doesn't touch. Water matters. It matters socially, ecologically, economically, spiritually. And those impacted, those people who deal with the consequences want to say. So that's going to be a part of it. And the other part, and anybody, used to be I had to kind of explain climate change as a thing. I think that's commonplace now. We're talking about the age of adaptation. Resilience and taking uncertainty seriously is really going to be the challenge. We're going to have to do this. And that last little line there is something that I've been trotting around for for 10 years. And it's still true, which is good. And my sort of, hypothesis or my forecast is that water law governance will change more in the next 10 years than it has over the last 100. And that was true 10 years ago, and I'm right, so I was right then. And I'm saying, I'm doubling down. I'm gonna say it's gonna be right the next 10 years again. We're gonna see so much rapid change, it's unbelievable. And it's really, I mean, in a sense, fortunate for me because it keeps me gainfully employed. So now I'll give you a little overview. So what are we gonna do here together? We're gonna take a little tour, global to local tour. I'm gonna share some of what I see as the big ideas in the water world. Then I'm going to show you some of the work, some of the research we've been doing over the last 10 years that really lay out this blueprint for watershed governance. And I'm really going to get into some of the law parts. And then I'm going to tell you that what next, right? That's the part where we're going to look in the crystal ball and we're going to guess what happens next. And I think what's very important here, I like to get a sense of the audience. So my first question usually is, we're going to talk about water laws, right? So who here is a lawyer? Lawyers? No lawyers. Okay. Who here is interested in law and policy? I hope some are. Okay, we got some. The truth is you should all be, right? Law and policy. What is law and policy? It's about how we as society, we as people live together. It's how we get along. It's how we resolve our disputes. It's how we make decisions collectively. So I'm going to say, maybe I'll rephrase. Now who thinks they care about law and policy, right? Like, oh wait, less hands. No, we got more hands, so that's good. So here we go. I'm gonna, also, I think it's important to understand that I'm not just your, the kind of research you might see at a university. I have a bit of a different complexion because I am both engaged in the research aspect, but the implementation and the active law reform aspect. So you need to kind of know where I'm coming from to know what I'm talking about. And I come from the University of Victoria, as the generous introduction indicated, but it really is a unique kind of space where we're dealing with law reform, policy, and some people like to call it a think tank, and I kind of go, ooh, think tank. How about a think and do tank? And so it is that sort of thing where we're trying to think about the issues, but also actively doing. You learn by doing. You have to engage, and especially when you talk about these cutting edge things. And you can see in the title there, right? POLIS Project on Ecological Governance. It's a bit of a mouthful. And it's important because this will influence how I look at the problem. And when I talk about ecological governance, we're really talking about the notion, the fundamental notion that environment is embedded in all levels of decision making. It's not just a sector. It's not just like a ministry. We go to the Ministry of Environment or we go to the Ministry of Transportation. It's the idea that ecology cross-cuts. Whether you're talking about business or industry or education or humanity or religion or spirituality, ecology matters. So that's a part of it. And I think the way we kind of tackle this is these aren't things that have answers. These are hard things. These are emerging things. So we ask the question, what do societal decisions shaped by the principles of ecological sustainability look like? I'll give you a clue. Fundamentally different than how our world looks today. And the hard part, lots of people can tell you how the world should look. How do we get there? How do we get there from here? And that's kind of my entry point. Now I have to give you the warning, right? How many here in the audience are water people, like people who study water or deal with water? Well, got about half the crew, that's good. You won't need me to tell you that you should be worried about the state of our water. But for some of our guests who don't know that much about water, I'm going to share a little bit of what I call the escalating freshwater crisis. I used to call this slide some version of, is the crisis looming? And then I started saying, well, it's beyond looming, it's loomed, right? So now we know the crisis is here. And we know things like persistent pollution, we know we have growing concentrated demands, we know about drinking water crisis. You can hardly open up a newspaper without seeing them, and it's particularly acute when you're talking about Indigenous people or on First Nations. You know about over-allocation, you know about fish in the mud, you know about disruption of natural flows, we know about conflicts, and we know about invasive species. These things used to be sort of pockets of problems. They are pretty common, and we're seeing them everywhere. This is just a quick tour of some of the hotspots. And the reason I'm interested in hotspots is not because I'm morbid and want to hear depressing news, but often these very challenging places reveal how humans respond to these problems. Not always well, but they give you some clues and some important clues about how you do law reform, what kinds of priorities you might make in governance. This slide is a slide that just to kind of give you some numbers, and I feel obligated. I'm amongst, Waterloo has a fabulous reputation, both globally and certainly in Canada, for its very good technical aspects. And so I thought obligated, a lawyer needs to talk a bit about some numbers. And so these are the numbers I picked for us today, right? 90% of all natural hazards are water related. Frequency and intensity are rising. So if you didn't think you cared about water, that should help you care about water. Since 1900, more than 11 million people have died due to drought alone. More than 2 billion have been affected by drought, more than any other physical hazard. 60 million people worldwide displaced, increasing every day. I can hardly keep up with that number. Just a little quote, the number one. According to Doctors Without Borders, in Africa, the number one health issue is no longer AIDS. It's drought. It should send a little tingle up your spine. It still does for me. Of course, we're not just talking about humans. There's a huge concern that freshwater ecosystems, the most endangered in the world, with significant threats across the deck. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but this is the part where then I also say, it's not just me or the water people I hang out that worry about this. The World Economic Forum does an annual global risk report, and they show water crisis as the top global risk in the top 5, 8 consecutive years. So this is the realm where business decisions and long-term investment decisions are routinely discussed. They are understanding water as an issue. Of course, we're here in Canada. We're safe. We look around, lots of water, nothing to worry about. And I say, no, the great Canadian water myth, right? That we have this wonderful abundance. Let's be aware, ecology matters. Most of our fresh water is up north, far away from where most of us live. Many of the big rivers flow north, like the Mackenzie. We have no national water strategy. We have extremely high use in Canada and demand. We have aging infrastructure. We have First Nations drinking crisis just about every corner of this landscape we see. I was part of a group that did a quick review, and you can't really see the details, and you don't need to. You can look at some of our reports if you want. But the point here was just in a superficial review, we see hot spots everywhere. And the problems are different, but it's somewhat equally distributed in the sense that no place doesn't have a problem. I, of course, am from BC. Here you can see that map. We have all the standard problems. I can talk a little more authoritatively about what's happening in BC because I'm living it. Climate change, population growth, resource extraction, over-allocation. I remember when we talked about BC, I helped develop BC's first drought policy. I know that I don't look that old, but I'm not. I'm a young guy, and I'm the one who helped them develop their drought policy. It means they haven't had one for a very long time. And now, look at those dates, 2015, 2018, 2019, all serious drought years. And then I like to call it's the Californication of the West. What's happening? We are becoming a lot like California. 10 years ago, we did a research report comparing the legal systems, and people told me I was crazy. Oliver, you're crazy. Stop comparing us to California. You're nothing like California. You're in Canada, for God's sakes. I beg to differ. Things are changing, and that's what it looks like. This is what drives a lot of policy change, right? It's conflict. That's how Westerners deal with water rights issues. So that's the depressing part. Now I'm going to pivot to some of the good news, right? I promise you all you'll go home happy, I hope. So some of the big ideas in the water world. We're going to focus in on one of them, the watershed governance, the idea of shared decision-making at the watershed scale. I often talk about it's not an if, but a when question. Is it in response to a series of crises that get us ever closer to the edge, or is it in anticipation? But there's a number of concepts we could be aware of. If I was talking to a group of lawyers, we'd be digging into concepts like the public trust doctrine, or the idea, a novel idea which, it's becoming more commonplace, but the idea that a river could have rights. Ooh, blows your mind on one hand, but on the other hand, when you think about corporations have rights. Why can't nature have some rights? So this is some of the themes that are sort of coming up in response to some of these challenges. But before we get too far down there, and I don't want to lose anybody in the audience, I want to talk a bit about how I think about law, policy, and governance. And I use this little bundling of images to help us. I think most of us understand laws, right? The rules. We understand the idea of rules and consequences. I think it's also important to understand it's about how we live together. All societies, since time eternal, have had laws, and that's an important part of it. Policy is like the compass heading. It helps us understand which direction, what's our priority, where are we headed. And governance is one of these terms that sometimes feels obvious, sometimes feels unnecessary, and then sometimes offers us something. And I think in this context, governance does offer us something, and that's the idea of decision making. And so I like to think of that image. You know, we can think of corporate governance, right? That board of directors sitting around the table making decisions, but also perhaps the cockpit, right? Where you're pulling the levers, where you're making decisions that are having consequences on the ground. And I really differentiate governance from management. Management being those operational activities on the ground. It asks this question of, does things right? You can do the wrong thing, but you can do it very well. Management can fit in that realm. Governance focuses on the ends. Are we doing the right thing? It asks these bigger questions. Is this what we want? So it's the process of social decision making and holding those to account. The who, the what, the how of decision making. How do we make decisions? What information do we use? What cultural reference do we use? What knowledge system do we use? Accountability is very important. And we don't need to look very far in the newspaper to see this question of accountability coming up more and more. It's about power. So this is kind of the context within which we operate. Why does governance matter? Well, it builds important social resilience. It's about how we adapt to change. It enables innovation. It can increase this accountability. It engages the public. It's about how we live together and operate both now and into the future. I like to use this slide, right, because all my non-lawyer friends say, oh, God, you jokers just push paper around. These guys push paper around. This is more than just pushing paper around, right? So I want to put us in a little bit of context. Water law, this says putting BC's water law, but it's really Canadian water law and governance in context. And it really is this fundamental notion that communities and the public in some areas are extremely sophisticated. They intuitively understand that protecting water has something to do with expertise, science, and traditional knowledge. They know that rules and enforcement matter, and they know that citizens and the local control, including planning, are going to be critical. The hard part is figuring out what mix of that cocktail will work. And that's often, again, where the law comes in. The other thing that's interesting about water, or the thing that I like about water, is that it has an uncommon, I call it the uncommonly common consensus. We don't see very many things that we fully agree on, but water seems to be one of them. 93% agree, this is public polling now, fresh water is Canada's most precious resource. And you can see sort of a word cloud there of the kinds of words and other factors that one could consider. And so water is exceptionally important. And certainly where I'm from, and this probably holds across Canada, but certainly in the West, 74% are concerned that water is managed poorly or very poorly. So we know it's unbelievably important. We're not doing a very great job with it. So people always ask me, okay, Oliver, well, who decides? And it's not an easy answer, right? And I could do a big constitutional law thing, but we won't, because I'm just going to keep it simple and say, you know, the federal government, the provincial government, the local government, City Hall, and Indigenous nations. We know that those are authority holders. We know that they are going to be part of who decides. What the right mix is, how that's changing is a big challenge. We've seen a big evolution, and that's why I like doing this work, because it isn't just static. A lot of people think of the law as a static thing, written in the textbooks. We look at it, and then it's locked in forever. Well, I'm going to argue it is not. We have a history of this top-down approach. We know that Indigenous rights and title around water especially remain uncertain and often ignored. We see some experimentation with water and markets in Alberta, more common in places like Australia, South Africa. We also see an international trend towards increased protection of water and nature and the sharing of authority, this whole idea that multiple of us will have to make some of these decisions. We can see evidence of this right here in Canada, right? Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, Northwest Territories, and increasingly BC. And that will get us to what I think alludes to kind of where we need to be thinking. We need to rethink governance in this watershed context. We know that government is going to be critical, but governance is about more than just government. It's about the whole suite of decision maker. Key actors like civil society, like business, like community, like the increasing integration of indigenous laws and legal orders into our system. It's about formal and informal structures, right? The persuasion. How many of us drink coffee? Come on, I think more. How many of you actually think about fair trade coffee? Right? Almost as many people who think about coffee think about fair trade coffee. There's no law, there's no rule, you don't have to do this. That's informal. That's persuasion of that type. So that's on that one scale. Formal is when you're breaking the rules, there are consequences. And ultimately, long-term sustainability of watersheds means we have to integrate these ecosystems into the decision-making approach. So to help us do this a bit, I'm going to try and give you a couple pictures about what I think watershed governance might look like. I'm going to start right here with the famous Russian dolls, right? The little dolls that my girls play with at home. That helps us think about nested systems. Ecologists understand nested systems very well because when you think of natural systems, you have a little stream, aquifer, you then have a bigger river into a lake, into a big basin. This is a nested system. Well, we need to think about our laws and our legal systems and our governance structures in the same way. They need to be nested, they need to move across scales, across silos, and they need to work in an integrated way. So there's a nested component to it. This idea of nested and watershed governance and what it could look like was the focus of a big research initiative. It was 3-year intensive public policy and governance research. We identified 6 principles, 9 winning conditions, 12 action items, and 5+ years of experience with implementation now. So are we getting there? Yes. Are we there? No, not even close. Some days I feel like we're losing ground. But the point is that this is about that fundamental shift, bringing us back to that opening statement. In the next 10 years, the laws will change more than they have in the last 100. That's like a forecast because if they don't, we are going to be in a lot of trouble. And I gave you all the depressing news. So I'm saying that we can get past that. But so you know, you're going to fairly say, okay, you promised to tell us what does it look like? Give us the answer. Surely somebody smart out there, New Zealand, they figured it out, haven't they? Or Australia, or I don't know, somewhere in Europe. Form follows function is an extremely important design principle. So that means the local context matters a ton. And that means we can take aspects and principles and elements and learn from other places and other experiences, of course. But there is no one single simple answer. Pause for a moment. So I know your first reaction to say is clearly a family portrait, right? Clear resemblance. What do these 5 images have in common? What are they? Just yell it out. What? Fantasy creatures. That's the perfect governance model. It is a mythical creature. It does not exist. We have to figure it out in place and in the local context. There are, though, some hints, I think, and in classic lawyerly fashion, I will not tell you the answer, but I'll tell you what it is not. It is not a silver bullet solution, nor should it be an excuse to download. It is not one size fits all, so be very wary of the perfect model from elsewhere. It is not neat and tidy, it's ugly, and requires hard work and learning by doing. And it is not quick and easy. It's a process over time that requires building trust. It's a tool, collaboration is a tool to engage citizens to help society live in a watershed limit. We have limits and we have to learn how to live with them. This is a piece where if we have some time in the questions, we'll go into it in a little more technical detail. These are some of the primary activities you see in places where it's working. No one place is doing it all right, right? Be wary of the models from elsewhere. And here are the 9 winning conditions that we've identified. And that's where I can now see people beginning to perspire. Oh God, he's going to do all 9, isn't he? Oh, can I get out of here? Don't worry, we're not doing all 9. We're only going to focus on the one that deals with the law. And I'm going to fib a little bit. We're going to do also a little bit about one of the very important ones relating to co-governance with indigenous governments. And then we're going to pivot into the law piece. It's very important to understand that we have a legal system. For most of us, that's based on the English common law system. If you're from Quebec, it's the civil law system. These are two legal orders that work very fine in Canadian history. What we forget sometimes is we also have an Indigenous component. And there are many Indigenous nations, probably in the order of 200, and they have legal orders. So when we have to think about the legal orders, we live in a multi-juridical system in Canada. We have many legal orders. Most of us are mostly focused just on the common law or the Crown or Western law one, but we have done things like sign the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. This means that we're going to be engaging Indigenous nations through their own representative institutions. This is where these legal orders begin to come together. This does not mean all parties are involved in all decisions, but they decide where collaboration is necessary or not. And then I like that picture there where we begin to talk about bending the beams. It means that these institutions, like all legal institutions, change over time. You have to bend the beams. We're going to have to change how we think legally. If we had some constitutional lawyers, we'd have a nice, vigorous discussion around Section 35 of the Constitution Act. But the important piece is to remember that consent and the idea of consultation are legal thresholds, that collaboration and joint decision-making is a much higher standard. We're not talking about the minimum legal line, and I felt obligated, I have to mention at least one legal case. It happens to be from the West, but it is the law of the land. It's a Supreme Court of Canada decision called Silcotin, where it basically affirms that in traditional territories, in Aboriginal lands, there is an explicit role for decision-making for Indigenous people, and that you're at very high risk if you are not doing this properly. So there is serious recognition at the highest courts, the highest legal levels. What does that look like? That is a whole nother invitation. Maybe one day I can come back and be part of a group that might talk about that, because this is changing in real time. I'm just going to end the co-governance piece with the simple notion that reconciliation of this history with our Indigenous neighbors is simply the only answer and the only road to peace. Now, let's talk a bit about the functioning legal framework. So now we're going to dig into law a little bit. So I'm going to start with some serious legal text. Okay, no, I'm not. This is our very simple molecule, right? I hope the water people can recognize it. Maybe some of you others can as well. 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen, simple molecule. But in the law and in the governance system, it's extremely complex. When lawyers mostly think about water, this is what they think about. They think about the minimum you need for the fish, and you need to think about drinking water. That's what they worry about. But I'm going to challenge us a little bit. I'm going to give us a little travel from the raindrop from the sky to the source at the end, and I'm going to give you the overlay of how the laws interact with that. So you talk about source water, you talk about source protection, you talk about environmental flows, you talk about habitat, you're talking about navigation, you're talking about groundwater, you're talking about urban water, you're talking about conservation, you're talking about drinking water and treatment and wastewater. This is all the journey of water. And each of these little frames is a different set of laws and a different jurisdiction that is often responsible. So you get into a very complicated world when you journey with water. And remember, water is always in motion. As any good lawyer, I bring pictures of laws. So let me show you what I think the law, especially water law in BC, looks like in the context of our other legal instruments. In the bottom part of this graph, you see all the myriad of laws that deal with water in the Crown system. We know we have an Indigenous water laws that is going to have to intermeld. We know we have treaties, and we know that we have constitutional protections in the form of Section 35. So we're going to talk about one particular piece of it, recognizing as part of a much larger galaxy, a constellation of possibilities. I will argue that this Water Sustainability Act offers us some insight into the future. This is my piece where I'm going to now tell you a little story. I'm going to tell you a story about a hot summer day in 2009. An inspector from the BC Ministry had a tough choice to make. Whether to cut off water from a rancher in the Nicola Valley in the BC interior, this rancher had a water entitlement, meaning a license. In his mind, he had a right. Yet the creeks and rivers outside Merritt, BC were running low. Spawning kokanee were stuck and could swim no further. Failed attempts to convince for voluntary action meant the next steps needed to be taken. This in BC triggered for the first time, as part of this 10 years of law reform I told you, the front end, a critical flow provisions, which later got translated into the new act. This had just come into power, and it meant that the taps could be turned off. The water was cut off. The river flowed, and the next day the fish swam by. This is a true story. It illustrates 3 important points, right? Water flow, or sometimes called environmental flows, plays a critical role in our ecosystems and our ecosystem health. Human use can sometimes compete with other species' needs. That's the second point. And the third point is that legal rules and mechanisms are needed to settle these competing demands. And the current entitlement structure is not very effective at addressing these ecological challenges we are facing. This, of course, is not a unique story. Many examples all around the world, across North America, but a big deal for me in BC because this triggers this moment where we're recognizing we have to now live in limits. When the drafters of the early laws and the early constitutions, they thought about the world in a very different way. And this is just to give you a vignette. This is what BC probably people thought about 100 years ago or over 100 years ago when the first BC Water Act was drafted. It was in response to gold mining. It was the pesky Americans coming up and Canada being a place of rules and law and order needed to manage the gold miners. And critical to gold mining is water. So 100 years ago, it's actually around 1909. You can imagine British Columbia was a very different place. So we have this sort of colonial water law foundation, right? And these laws are set up for one purpose, gold mining and agricultural development to help the economy grow. They were not environmental laws. Much to my chagrin, a young law student goes to law school because he wants to learn about environmental laws and learns that most of the laws have nothing to do with about the environment. It's about extracting from the environment. It fundamentally ignored First Nations rights and title and asserts Crown ownership with 3 basic principles. And I'm not going to dwell on these, but I'm going to take one moment to talk about one of them. It's called first in time, first in right. Who's heard of first in time, first in right? Oh, this is pretty good. That's not bad. First in time, first in right. Well, for those of you who haven't heard about it, you actually do know about this legal principle. You learned it in kindergarten. It's the same as I had it first. It's the I had it first legal principles. The lawyers don't like that, sounds too ordinary, so they dress it up in Latin, and sometimes they call it some other things. But they said it's not, in Canada, it's not just who had it first, it's who did the paperwork first, right? Who did the paperwork first? That's the oldest license, that's how you give it out. So the person with the oldest license gets their full entitlement, and then the next, and so it goes. Not a problem when you have lots. Big problem when you don't have enough, because that means those junior licenses, in theory, need to be cut off. It's a really big problem when you think about it from this perspective. The Indigenous people say, hey, this sounds like a great rule. We're in. Oh, wait a minute. You're not going to let us fill out the paperwork. So we clearly had it first, but you're not recognizing our version of first. It's only a certain set of people's first. And that's what's important about governance. Remember when I said the who, what, and how, and power? That's really critical. So a group basically said, we're going to decide who gets it first, and it's going to be in our little community, and the rest are going to be left out. This is a very stubborn problem because it's very hard to manage the resource very well when you have this kind of an allocation system. It's arguably as arbitrary as choosing to do it by height. I would love it if they did that. He who is tallest gets the most water. That would be a wonderful allocation system. The point is these legal principles are like that. They come from some piece, and we have to understand their origins if we want to try and untangle them. This is where I just want to show you a sense of what we are looking at, BC looks at now, right? This is a much more modern, realistic sense of where water touches on everything. And I'll just take a half moment to say, so how did they get to their new law? It took them 100 years. What did they have? They had trouble in the water. You couldn't deny it anymore. It was an awakening to new reality. So you can have problems, but if the public and the populace don't see it, you're going to not change very much. But we did see that. And there was a couple key events that we could talk about. And that creates that policy window and a political commitment. And out of that comes a new Water Sustainability Act. If I had more time, I'd tell you a bit more about the policymaking process, but it's not pretty. So what we have is a new Water Sustainability Act in force. Came in about 3 years ago now. Well, 4 years almost now, right? But it's still a work in progress. This isn't my house, but it could be my house because I'm on about 3 years of renovations myself. So I have a lot of metaphors around renovations. And that is very much what the law is like. This is a framework piece of legislation, meaning the bits that you actually care about when you live in the house, like having walls or doors or couches, those will happen in the form of regulations, and that will happen later. There are pieces that are in place, but that's why I can pretty safely say, guess what? 10 years more for sure, so I'm going to be right with my prediction. Now, let's take a moment and try and analyze this set of water laws. I can show you it's a very difficult, arcane art of analyzing laws. And I use the technique from our friend Sergio Leone, who, of course, helped direct and the architect of the Dollars trilogy of Westerns. This thrust Clint Eastwood into stardom. Of course, it's about gold, so it has a nice link to water in the sense that that's the gold we're after. And I use the simple filter of, well, what's good? So let's do the good, the bad, and the ugly of the new water law. So let's do that. So what's the good? Well, this will sound crazy, but BC did not regulate groundwater. The stream could run near empty, and right beside it, you could put a groundwater well, and that would be okay because that was not regulated. Why? Because a judge 100 years ago felt groundwater was complicated, and that was clearly separate and had nothing to do with the river. Well, any modern hydrology will tell you otherwise. It gives us some legal protection for environmental flows. It gives us some, I call them off-ramps or ways out of this fit-for problem, and gives us some of these new provisions. So that's some of what's good about it. The environmental flow piece is the one that I'm most interested in, but in the interest of time and making sure we have time for some conversation, I'm not going to dwell into the legal or the technical aspects of that. But this is a major leap forward for Canadian law to begin to protect the notion of an environmental flow, which if you don't want to spend the time reading the proper definition, I like to think it simply as the life pulse of a lake or a river. That is what environmental flow is. We have to keep the life pulse healthy and thriving, otherwise we're in trouble. And there's one way to really think about that, and that's the idea that environmental flows are different than just the bare minimum to survive. It is about thriving versus surviving. So what we have here is a picture of what it would take to survive, but to thrive is quite different. Ultimately, we're looking at an allocation system that fundamentally changes. Remember that first in time, first in right system? You can see when you don't have a very big population, the H sliver of the pie over time gets a little bigger until eventually there's nothing left for the environment. What we're talking about is figuring out how much the environment needs, how much water we keep in the river systems to keep it functioning and healthy, and then decide how much humans need. And when I'm talking about humans, I'm talking about humans in the sense of their use for the economy or for some of these other uses. Humans too are part of the ecosystem. So water for drinking, water for basic sanitation, of course, should be part of a necessary piece that we protect. But that's a separate conversation. The point is that we need to be thinking about this environment and our bare necessities before we start thinking about divvying up the pie. I'm going to skip ahead here to a little bit of the bad, right? So I'm not here just to tell you a good, feel-good story, but there is some problems with the new act. I've given you a sense that we still have this disconnect with the Indigenous legal parts. Crown ownership is still asserted. We still haven't really recognized Indigenous water rights. We still have FITFOR as a fallback position. So As we know, the law sometimes helps us resolve disputes, but it can sometimes create disputes. So that's an expensive way to deal with when we have problems with our neighbors. And it really ultimately relies on this discretionary decision-making by our legal systems. The ugly. There is an ugly, right? I told you the house is not finished. And that's why the next 10 years are really important. And this story is being played out everywhere in the world, I tell you this. Every jurisdiction is facing significant changes in how they deal with climate adaptation, which is water, by the way, or the way they're dealing with water. And so getting the devil in the details right. And one of the problems is we don't know very well how to trigger these key sustainability provisions. We don't know. The law is very bad at dealing with things that have happened. It doesn't look back very well. It can set up good rules for going forward, has real trouble dealing with what has happened. So those systems, those streams that are over-allocated, or the persistent droughts in systems that nobody imagined would ever dry up, that's going to be a real problem. And how do you fund it? This stuff isn't cheap. There's science, there's enforcement, there's monitoring, there's dispute resolution, there's ways to deal with how we live together. That's expensive. There's a gap, a big gap ahead of us. I'm going to skip ahead here to the where to next. If we had time, and if somebody wants, I'll spike my own. If you want to ask about the Canada Water Act, which is the federal legislation, I have some fun slides on that, but that'll be for another time. So where to next, right? We have uncertainty, we have risk, and we have resilience. We know that these are non-negotiable. So how do we deal with this? The challenge statement really is to do things differently. We need to start with water. We got to get the water right. And that means changing how we think about resource or environmental law, but we need to think about a whole bunch of different things about how our cities develop, how our financial systems assess risk, how we deal with health. These are all fundamental pieces. And this is just a simple diagram where I show you in BC all the places where water is becoming a prominent driving piece in the puzzle. You can't talk about salmon, you can't talk about reconciliation, you can't talk about land use planning, you can't talk about climate adaptation without water. So that's front and center. It's going to involve a whole different way of dealing with laws. The old system of the last 100 years is going to change. We're going to have to find partnership models where we have that Indigenous authority, the provincial and the federal governments working together to create the knowledge system. License holders, those people who are extracting water, are going to have to be part of the solution, and communities and watersheds are going to play along. What we have seen in BC, as we've seen in many places, there are many tools. Here's the little flavor of the tools, and I like to give, for some of us a little more simple-minded, a way to think about those tools. There's the very simple spork, all the way to the very complex Swiss Army knife. We don't have a lot of experience using these tools yet. These are going to be a big part of how we deal with the future. So what does success look like? Well, we have healthy watersheds with protected waters. We have entities that are making these decisions together, co-governance with a water-centric approach, and we have a whole bunch of authority holders participating in that. There's, of course, that dynamic tension. This is not going to happen overnight. There's a few examples where I can draw on in BC where we're seeing advances in the legislation and in the institutions here, but I won't dwell. I'm going to keep it simple. We have to move from managing the watershed to managing the people in the watershed. That's where law and governance really matters. I give you, for those in the audience who are interested in what's happening in BC, these are some of the ground zeros of these exact changes happening in real time. One of my favorite examples is in the Cowichan, which is a fascinating place. It's just up from where I live, about an hour away. Heritage River, but it's a living example of what happens when there's co-governance with the Indigenous nation, Cowichan tribes, and the local community making those tough decisions about keeping water in the streams for fish, keeping enough drinking water, having estuary health so you can eat the shellfish. It's that simple. So, within 30 seconds of my designated time, not too bad, water, not oil, will define the 21st century. We need to use less and keep it clean. use what we take more productively. So what we take, we got to use it like 10 times more productively. We have to learn to share and resolve those conflicts. That's a whole different way of being. We need to leave enough water in the system to ensure healthy, proper, functioning watersheds. There's more to the world than just humans. Ultimately, when we're talking about law, policy, and governance, citizens must engage, and I like this notion of a hydro citizenship as maybe a place to start. And with that, I say thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming today.
My wife says that to say hi. Her name's Corinne, and she lived with you in Costa Rica, apparently.
Oh, that is a small world. That's 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
and she said you helped dig a water supply system.
That's right.
So.
I worked on source protection, the real kind of source protection, because the landscape had become so denuded that these impoverished communities were having bad drinking water and all kinds of health effects. And so what they did is, in partnership with an interesting NGO from Canada, we worked with volunteers to basically bring nature's assets back to the landscape so the water would improve, and the community got itself out of this lowest poverty stage simply by fixing the water problem. So don't tell me water doesn't connect.
So Mike, I want to take you back to the, you kind of skipped past the Water Act.
Yeah, so which one are you talking about? So
well, no, I mean, just as a question or as a point of entry.
Yeah.
Because I have this contradictory feeling from your presentation. You made me feel good, but I'm confused as to why.
Yeah.
Because it seems like there was a lot of good things happening, but but boy, there's a lot of loose ends, right?
Yes.
And my question is about the Water Act, and we are so divided, but we're so dependent on water. Could we not rally around a rewritten Water Act? What do you think of that idea?
Absolutely. So you're talking Canada Water Act now. So the reason you probably feel confused, and lots of people who deal with me feel confused, so that you're a good company, Rob will know. Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that I'm trying to give a hopeful message in a challenging message. We have this thing happening. Water problems are going fast. We have some examples where we are responding, and we see some interesting evidence of an ability to respond, hence my vignette, hence the example of the BC Water Sustainability Act. But what we haven't yet, on so many environmental fields, we haven't yet taken the implementation all that seriously. There is one glaring gap, and that is, in our Constitution, the word water doesn't show up. So in essence, it's divided between the two authorities related to the Constitution. Here's our legal moment, right? So the provinces mostly deal with the majority of water issues. The federal government deals with things that touch water, like fish, like boats, like parks, also water that crosses boundaries, like borders and between provinces. Canada Water Act is a thing that happened in the early 70s, and it never really got fully implemented, and it is now under discussion. So to your question, I am optimistic because, Rob's lived it. For 25 years, we've been talking about this is an important part when we talk about our nested governance system. The federal government on the water file has largely been absent. They haven't done a great job on the science, and they certainly could be doing more, and that's a whole different conversation. But I see some early indicators of some potential. So if we had time here, I would have shown you some slides. I would have shown you a picture of our current, can we recognize who these people are? That's Justin, and that's his dad. That's when the Canada Water Act came in, and it has hardly been touched. So in the same way, and I use this little thing, I say, okay, that was some of us would have heard of them, and that's what a computer looked like. Some people in this room won't even know that's a computer. That Bridge Over Troubled Waters, that was the #1 song. That's what a cell phone looked like. And so you have that, but in the same way we have cell phones, none of us would go even 6 months without updating the operating system. Well, our laws and our institutions are like that. We have to update the operating system. So you have a massively out-of-date piece of legislation that is part of my future talk. Yes, that's the future. We need to get that piece in there. So I'm optimistic that we can do it. I'm seeing good evidence, especially around some of the indigenous co-governance pieces where we get really down to some of these ecological fundamentals. Are we going to pull the trigger? That's the part where you feel confused because it sounds like he's saying we could do it, but we're not doing it. So what will it take? And I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, 1 sec.
See, Rob's feeling bad for me. He said he'd ask a question only if nobody else, if they don't know what I'm talking about, so. There's a few students who know. I just think you're shy. You want to ask, come on.
So thanks, Oliver, for a really interesting and inspiring and challenging talk. I want to talk a little bit about the bar, though, and especially where you ended up with this idea of hydro-citizenship. And a small side example to take us where we want to go. I spent some time in the last few years hanging out with some folks from the public health community. And so they have a concept in the public health community called health in all policies. I don't know if you've heard that, right? But the health people have the exact same problem that we have, the water people, which is that, of course, health matters and everything matters to health, but health is isolated in ministries of health and health experts and health policy people. And so their answer is your answer, which is that we need to integrate concern for health in everything else rather than having a little health ghetto, right? Yeah. And so the problem, I guess, that they have is the problem that we have if we go down this route, which is that the bar is really high, right? And so in the same way that that we would find it difficult, perhaps, to sign on to, in everything that we do, the health in all policies perspective. There might be a dozen other people who have the same idea, by the way, right? Food in all policies, energy in all policies, whatever. So when we're thinking in terms of governance, are we making the bar too high if we're asking people and governments and communities and companies to think about, water all the time, right, in this really concerned way? Is an alternative to maybe design some institutions that can just kind of tick along and make the system run well without requiring us all to become water missionaries, Is there, I don't know if that's a kind of a rambly thought there, but in that space, what are your thoughts? Like, is this, this hydro-citizenship idea, is that too much relative to all the other pressures?
Yeah, and so let's put some context. If I come here and just tell you what I think, you're going to be more bored than you are now, I promise. So I have to kind of bring us to the edge. But I think the principle of there are certain fundamental things that we ought to think more about, health being one of them, and anybody here who uses alternative health, like acupuncture, or how about good nutrition, right? These are ways to integrate health into your lifestyle. Well, I don't think that we need to organize our garbage collection around water, but I do think we want to think about certain important aspects like how our industry is situated, or how our urban runoff operates, or what we do with waste, or how we make sure we don't take all the water out of the river or the stream. So I'm saying, in some cases, yes, water, like things like certain kinds of land use planning, things like, imagine this, in the law, drinking water laws are different than water that's not for drinking water, right? That's a missing piece in the integration. Water is one system. Let's take care of the whole system and then worry about some different aspects. So I think we can do much better there, and I think we can be thoughtful, and I would agree, but that's not for a 45-minute talk. That's for a 3-day workshop where we say, well, which ones are really important? And the idea that we do need some new and improved public institutions that do a better job of engaging our public, making those decisions in an ongoing way, having enough science to make them thoughtfully. And I know Rob knows all this. In fact, he's probably the architect of half of it. But the point is that we as a society, young students thinking about the future, those who are engaged and interested, should really think a little bit differently and not just take for granted. It's easy to take a 100-year-old Water Act and say, well, that's just how it is. Well, what's it doing? It's taking the last drop of water from river systems. It's providing an opportunity for people to put so much pollution that you can't drink the water, right? This is a problem. That's the restructuring I'm talking about. So I'm not so flippant to say it's everything. But I do think the idea, and I will stand by this, I've done resource law work in forestry, with fisheries. I've done some mining work. Nothing tickles the passion like water. You have a water meeting, people show up. People engage. So hydro-citizenship to me has some merit because you guys, I know in this community, there's concerns with Nestle and drinking water and bottled water. You can get people engaged in a different way than you can about some standard esoteric kinds of environmental issues that just seem out there and not relevant to us. Water is one of the only things that every single human has a relationship with every single day. That's unique.
Thank you. We got another question here.
Okay, thanks so much. Deborah Van Eyneton from Wilfrid Laurier. Thanks for a great talk, and it's got my brain going on a million different pathways. I want to go back to how you originally characterized the water regime and water law. You said there's formal elements and there's informal elements. My work is on the Rio Grande.
Oh, wonderful, yeah.
So their
Challenging.
water scarcity is a clear and present danger, and that's all anyone can talk about. But here's how I see the regime, and it makes me think a little differently in terms of how to use the wedge to crack things open for change in the future. The first is that the formal regime, as you've characterized it, and you're a lawyer, I'm not, I'm a policy person, a political scientist, it's tough to change.
Very difficult, yeah.
So the formal regime that's the legislation, that's the treaties, that's where you create a duty to act, that's where you have water allocations that are written in law. That's really hard to change. That stuff doesn't bend. And it's not very open, transparent. It doesn't tend to encourage public engagement. Many of it is decades, maybe 100 years old.
Yep.
And so in terms of trying to change water law, I think it's great that some of those mechanisms got into legal change in BC. But if you look at Alberta and Saskatchewan, my impression is that they didn't have as much success trying to crack open and change those laws. Then secondly, you have the informal regime, which is where you have the councils and the task forces, and you have watershed initiatives, and you have innovation, and it's open and transparent, and there's so much there to be happy about. The problem is that it's very vulnerable. It's politically vulnerable, it's economically vulnerable, it's vulnerable to resource change. How do you link what is happening informally and is innovative and open to that formal regime in such a way that you actually get change and recognize the reality that a lot of that law is not going to change? And I guess I don't feel as optimistic that we're going to get a good water law in Canada.
So there's a couple of lots in there, and I think that's a fabulous question. I'm just going to try and hit it sort of systematically. I think, first off, I would say that what we're looking for now is no longer, 25 years ago, one could be idealistic and say we want the best. I'm happy with better. So we can get better. That I know. I've seen it. We can be part of it. It takes a long time. I use the example of formal and informal to really demonstrate that there's a spectrum, and that relates to power and the way the rules play out. And it's common to go to meetings and non-lawyers will often say there ought to be a law. And I'm often cautious because a law does not necessarily, Canada is rich with laws that are never implemented or are highly discretionary. And we're not going to fundamentally change our legal culture, our legal regime. We're going to always have ministerial discretion and these kinds of provisions in there. So we're never going to get away from that. So in fact, a proper legal regime change requires us to build up those informal pieces, those people who operationalize it. There's a wonderful little bumper sticker in law school, right? You can't legislate out stupidity, right? People who don't want to do stuff aren't going to do it. You can make the consequences and you can give incentives. Pricing can do that too. Markets can help you with that, but you got to be very cautious when you're dealing with public goods. So you have to really understand the interplay of the practice, the culture, and that's why, and I know what Rob's saying, he's saying, well, is it realistic for us to be hydro citizens? I hope so, because by engaging and making that the norm, in the same way that we at least put our recycling in the recycling box, we are a little bit cognizant. We got a long way to go, but if we start thinking about water in a variety of ways, that will include local councils and the way a community group might make decisions. A lot of the very best restoration efforts come from voluntary action, not because it's legislated, right? Stopping the stupid is hard. Laws alone won't do it. We're going to need a mix. So I am 100% on board with your suggestion that we need to do this. And I'm going to add one last piece, which is your point. It is very vulnerable. When we have reliance on the legal system and voluntary action, priorities change. You know, like you can read a new article every day and it'll change what you should or shouldn't do. That's why that engaged citizenry is actually fundamental. And I use the analogy, at least to the law students, that, you know, law reform and the environment side is a lot like playing snakes and ladders, but you have no ladders. Meaning, I can get us to, if I play the game just right, I can get us to the end. But it's so easy. Takes me 10 years, took 10 years to make that new law in BC. It will take the next government 6 months to undo it. So that's a tough game to play. But if you can get a constituency behind it and you can make it harder and harder and you have it playing out across the different stages of the nested piece where you have local governments making bylaws and provincial governments, you know, having water sustainability planning regimes and the federal government providing the science, and you have indigenous governments using their authority, you begin to create some redundancy and you get some resilience that doesn't make it as vulnerable to one bad, I don't know, president, for example, or whatever your legal system might be.
Okay, I know that there are a couple of more questions, but I propose we stop here. Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you very much.